All right, welcome back to Tragedy and Hope Live. Got a couple things to get to before we get into the book. First of all, I've got Karlin Boroshenko's channel here. I've got a link for you in the description to her channel. Now, I wanted to talk a little bit more about these AoE attacks because I'm kind of finding it really interesting that the government can't figure out how to do an AoE attack anymore. All right, this is from media.defense.gov 2025 December 30th. All right, it's a PDF, and it says that they still have the active denial technology where they can shoot a beam of microwave radiation at people and make it feel like they're heating up, and basically they just want to run away. So I'm wondering why they're not deploying this, why they're deploying tear gas. And then we got right here, this is an even more low-tech version of an AoE attack, right? Think about it. It's been the middle of January to December in North America. There's fire hydrants all over Minnesota, right? It's freezing cold out. Can't just spray these people with fire hoses, right? You gotta throw tear gas at them and all this other weird stuff. I guarantee if you soak them all with fire hoses in the middle of February in North America, in the northern part of North America, they're going to get a little chilly. It might get a tidbit nipply out. You know what I'm saying? I don't know. Maybe I'm just completely insane on that. We're talking about non-lethal crowd dispersal. Seemed like, could be pretty effective in the middle of winter. I don't know. Like I'm saying, I'm not a, PhD in thermodynamics or whatever. I don't even know what you call that, a thermodynamicist, or I don't know. I'm not a PhD thermodynamicist, so maybe shooting people with water in the middle of winter doesn't make them cold. Maybe I'm completely off on that. Okay, so here we go. Chapter 19, The New Era, 1957 to 1964. The chapters we got in here are Growth of Nuclear Stalemate, Shifting Power Balance, Denouncement of the Cold War 1957 to 1963, Disintegrating Superblocks, Latin America, Race Between Disaster and Reform, the Far East, the Japanese Miracle, Communist China, and the Eclipse of Colonialism. All right. The Growth of Nuclear Stalemate. The decade from 1953 to 1963 was the most critical in modern history. Man's ability to get through it successfully was a tribute to his good luck and good sense. The avoidance of nuclear war and the extraordinary burst of economic prosperity in the advanced industrial nations during that decade were balanced by the continued growth of acute social disorganization and the even more acute growth of ideological confusions. Nevertheless, man survived, and by 1963 was at the opening of a new era, based very largely on the relaxation of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union, and on the opportunities to do something about the lagging social and intellectual problems provided by the combination of political relaxation and economic prosperity. The decade as a whole fell into two parts, divided about 1956. The first 3 years were marked by the continued race for the H-bomb, and covered the period from the early thermonuclear explosions in 1953 to the achievement of a fusion bomb that could be dropped from an airplane in 1956. The next 7 years were filled with the missile race and reached their culmination and denouncement in the year from the Cuban Missile Crisis of October to November 1962 to the death of President Kennedy in November 1963. Closely related to this division based on weapons development was the somewhat delayed division in the decade into two parts by a change in American strategic policy. Here, the dividing point was about 1960 and is marked by the shift from the strategy of massive retaliation associated with the name John Foster Dulles to the strategy of graduated deterrence associated with the new Democratic administration of President Kennedy. The shift in 1960, however, was only incidentally associated with the presidential election of that year and the subsequent shift of the administration in the White House. The real change in 1960 was brought about, as we shall see, by the full achievement at that time of intercontinental thermonuclear striking ability by the two great superpowers. The balance of terror thus achieved by 1960 led directly to the missile crisis of 1962 and the thermonuclear stalemate of 1963. And these developments led to major changes in the political and ideological structures of the areas of the world, changes that are still going on. The shifting balance of power. As we have seen, the whole period of 1953 to 1960 in the area of defense was dominated by the so-called New Look, the Republican effort to reduce the cost of the American defense effort by shifting from containment to massive retaliation. This involved a reduction in the American defense budget from an average of $43 billion a year over the last four Truman budgets, 1949 to 1953, to an average of 37.4, billion over the six Eisenhower budgets of 1954 to 1960. In this process, American military power was reduced from 3.7 million men to 2.5 million over the 6 years, January 1953 to January 1959. Foreign economic aid was decreasingly emphasized. In this fashion, the effort to deter Soviet aggression was based more on completely on the threat of American nuclear attack by SAC bombers on the Soviet homeland and less on American readiness to meet Soviet forces on the ground or to win third powers to our side by economic or other aid. Dulles, who saw the world in black and white terms, refused to recognize the right of anyone to be neutral, and tried to force all states to join the American side in the Cold War or be condemned to exterior darkness. Thus, having divided the world into two blocks, he sought to set up between them a continuous circuit of paper barriers along the land frontiers of the Soviet bloc from the Baltic Sea across Europe and Asia to the Far East. The chief portions in the barrier were the North Atlantic Treaty Organization in Europe, 1949, the Central Treaty Organization, 1955, in the Near and Middle East, Centro, and the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, CETO, in the Far East, 1954. In theory, the paper barrier was made continuous by the presence of Turkey in both NATO and Centro, and of Pakistan in both Centro and CETO. Dulles cared little about the military strength, economic prosperity, or political democracy of the states forming this paper ring around the Soviet bloc, since their chief function was to form a paper barrier so that any movement outward by Russia or its satellites by breaking the paper would trigger the tripwire circuit that hurled America's nuclear retaliatory power on the Soviet homeland. In theory, this strategic policy meant that any outward movement by the Soviet Union or by one of its satellite states in some remote jungle or on some barren mountaintop of Central Asia might lead to all-out nuclear war initiated by the United States, which would totally destroy European civilization as we know it. For, until 1960, the ability of either of the superpowers to strike directly at one another from its own soil was very limited, and accordingly, the two superpowers had to strike from or strike at bases in Europe or the Far East. This change, which took place over the period 1956 to 1962, is of major significance since it meant that the Soviet Union and the United States became capable of striking directly at each other and did not have to involve third powers in their disputes immediately. From the weapons point of view, it represented on the American side three changes. One, the shift in manned bombing planes from the long-range B-47s to the intercontinental range B-52s and B-58s. 2. The shift in missiles from the intermediate range ballistic missiles, IRBMs, such as Thor or Jupiter, which had to be based in Turkey, Italy, or Britain in order to reach the Soviet Union, to intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, such as the Minuteman or Atlas, which could hit the Soviet Union from launching sites in the United States. And 3. The advent, about 1960, of the nuclear-propelled Polaris submarines, whose 16 nuclear-armed missiles could strike the Soviet Union from submerged positions in the seas bordering the Eurasian landmass. This American capacity to strike the Soviet homeland from North America was not achieved so quickly or so completely on the Russian side, even by the time the nuclear stalemate had been reached in 1963. As a result, the Soviet Union could strike at the United States only by striking at its bases or its allies in NATO or in the Far East. At first, in the 1950s, such a Soviet counterstrike would have been largely by the Soviet ground forces invading westward across Central Europe, but by the late 1950s, as the Soviet strategic striking forces were strengthened by its acquisition of strategic bombing planes like the Tu-16 and of IRBMs, this Soviet counterstrike to America's massive retaliation would have resulted in the nuclear destruction and radioactive pollution of much of Europe. The gradual shift of American retaliatory power from intermediate range to intercontinental range in 1962 reduced the Soviet pressure on Europe by reducing the importance of America's European bases. This had many significant implications for all the nations of Europe, both communist and Western. The key to the missile race rested on the fact that the United States and the Soviet Union took opposite routes in their efforts to obtain nuclear-armed rockets. One basic problem was how to combine the American A-bomb of 1945 with the German V-2 rocket. Since the A-bomb was an egg-shaped object 5 feet wide and 10 feet long, which weighed 9,000 pounds, and the V-2 could carry a warhead of only 1,700 pounds 200 miles, the problem was not easy. The Soviet government sought to close the gap between rocket power and nuclear payload by working towards a more powerful rocket, while the American scientists, over the opposition of the Air Force and the aviation industry, sought to close the gap by getting smaller bombs. The result of the race was that the Soviet Union in 1957 to 1962 had very large boosters, which gave it a lead in the race to propel objects into space or into ballistic orbits around the Earth. But these were very expensive, could not be made in large numbers, and were very awkward to install or to move. The United States, on the other hand, soon found it had bombs of all sizes, down to small ones capable of being used as tactical weapons by troops in ground combat and able to be moved about on jeeps. As a consequence of the American decision to reduce the size of the bomb, a decision for which the great scientist Robert Oppenheimer was largely responsible, by the early 1960s, the United States was producing large numbers of warheads in a great variety of sizes, capable of being delivered by all kinds of vehicles, from tactical rockets and cannons up through Polaris missiles, airplanes of all sizes, and rockets of all ranges, up to city-destroying bombs carried by gigantic SAC bombers or ICBMs. Apparently, the Soviet success in obtaining the A-bomb in 1949, in dropping the H-bomb in 1953, and in startling the world with its powerful rocket boosters in 1957, not only alarmed the United States, but also lulled the Kremlin itself into the mistaken idea that it was ahead of the United States in the development of missile nuclear weapons. This so-called missile gap was a mistaken idea, for the vast expansion of American production of nuclear materials begun in 1950, combined with the simultaneous reduction in the sizes of nuclear warheads by 1959, was bringing the United States into a condition of nuclear plenty and of overkill capacity that posed a grim problem for the Soviet Union. It was, strangely enough, just at that time, end of 1957, that two American studies, the Gauthier Report and the Special Studies Project of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, suggested the existence of a missile gap, or inferiority in missile capacity of the United States compared to the Soviet Union. This judgment, apparently based on overemphasis on the size of the Soviet rocket boosters, played a chief role in the American presidential campaign of 1960 and in the ebullient self-confidence of Khrushchev and his associates in 1957 to 1961. The reality of the situation apparently was not recognized in Moscow until 1961, when it penetrated with a cold shock of fear through the deceptive festivities of self-congratulation that had begun with the success of Sputnik 1, October 1957, and the successful moonshot Lunik 2 of September 1959. In this pleasant period of self-deception, intensified by the American presidential campaign's unrealistic discussion of the missile gap in 1960, the Kremlin entered upon an unofficial international suspension of nuclear bomb testing, the test moratorium, from October 30th, 1958 to October 23rd, 1961. Suddenly, in 1961, the Soviet authorities recognized that they had fallen far behind the United States, both in number and variety of nuclear weapons, because their existing nuclear bombs were too large for many purposes, especially for accurate and numerous long-range ICBMs. Accordingly, in October 1961, the Soviet Union broke the test moratorium of 3 years by resuming nuclear testing, but to conceal the purpose of the tests in seeking smaller bombs, they aimed their publicity on the tests at the fact that they exploded the largest bomb ever used, a 58 megaton fusion thermonuclear monstrosity. After these tests, it soon became clear to the Soviet Union that the American lead in ICBMs could not be overcome by the Soviet Union in view of its limited industrial capacity and the other urgent demands on that capacity in any period of time that had strategic meaning. Accordingly, Moscow, probably at the instigation of the Red Army itself, decided to remedy its weakness in ICBMs by seeking to move some of its numerous ICBMs within range of the United States by secretly installing them in Castro's Cuba. This decision, if we have analyzed it correctly, showed once again the way in which the Soviet defense strategy moved in a direction opposite to that which was influencing American defense decisions. Just at the time, summer 1962, that the Soviet Union was deciding to remedy its weakness in ICBMs by trying to install IRBMs in a third power close to the United States. The latter was deciding that its supply of ICBMs was increasing so rapidly that it would close down its IRBM bases in third countries close to the Soviet Union, such as Turkey. This American decision was already beginning to be carried out when the Cuban Missile Crisis broke in October 1962. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a turning point in Soviet-American relations, similar in some ways to the Fashoda Crisis in 1898 between France and England. It showed both sides that neither wanted a war and that their interests were not antithetical on all points. Thus, it signaled the suspension of the Cold War and of the all-out insane armaments race between them. It showed that the United States had missile superiority sufficient to veto any major Soviet aggression, while the Soviet Union had sufficient missile power in combination with the generally non-aggressive American attitude to discourage the United States from using its missile superiority to make any aggression on the Soviet Union. Thus was established a nuclear or power stalemate of nuclear vetoes between the United States and the Soviet Union that secured each against the other. This American-Soviet stalemate, by inhibiting the use of the power of each, permitted third powers to escape to a considerable extent from the need to have power sufficient to back up their actions. This meant that third states could undertake actions which their own power could not itself justify or enforce. That is to say that the superpower stalemate allowed third states a freedom of action beyond their own intrinsic power. Thus, Indonesia could attack Malaya, China could attack India, Pakistan, although allied to the United States, could be cozy with Red China. Cyprus could defy Turkey, Egypt could attack Yemen, France could defy the United States, Romania could flirt with Peking, and Britain or Spain could trade with Castro's Cuba without the superpowers feeling free to use their own real strengths to obtain what they wanted, since most of these strengths were neutralized opposing each other. One significant consequence of this situation was the almost total collapse of the system of international law that had been formulated in the 17th century by the work of writers like Grotius. That system of international law had regarded the state as the embodiment of sovereignty, an organization of political power on a territorial basis. The criteria for the existence of such a sovereign state had been its ability to defend its boundaries against external aggression and to maintain law and public order among its inhabitants inside those boundaries. By 1964, as a consequence of the power stalemate of the Cold War, dozens of states, such as the Congo, could perform neither of these actions, were recognized as states by the superpowers and their allies, and achieved this recognition in international law by being admitted to the United Nations. This development culminated over 50 years of destruction of the old established distinctions of international law, such as the distinctions between war and peace, destroyed by the Cold War, which was neither between belligerents and neutrals, destroyed by British economic warfare in World War I, or between civilians and combatants, destroyed by submarine warfare and city bombing. Nuclear stalemate in the Cold War context made it possible for political organizations with almost none of the traditional characteristics of a state not only to be recognized as states, but to act in irresponsible ways and to survive on economic subsidies won from one bloc by threatening to join or merely to accept subsidies from the other bloc. As a consequence of this situation, all the realities of international affairs by 1964 had become covered with thick layers of law, theories, practices, and agreements that had no relationship to reality at all. Today, the pressure of the realities beneath that layer to break through it and emerge into the daylight where they could be generally recognized has reached a critical point. As part of that process of increasing sanity, which the recognition of reality always is, the future of disarmament became more hopeful than it had been in decades, although the chances of reaching any substantial disarmament agreements remained slight. This means that disarmament is more likely to appear in the form of nuclear disengagement and tacit adoption of parallel actions than in the form of explicit agreements or signed documents. The amount of myth and false theories that must be pushed aside to permit even the highest peaks of reality to emerge is very large. In the United Nations alone, it involves such points as the recognition of the Congo as a state, the belief that Taiwan is a great power worthy of one of the 4 permanent veto-wielding seats on the Security Council, or the pretense that Red China, in spite of its possession of all the traditional attributes of statehood, does not exist. Part of this return to reality is embodied in the growing recognition that there are more situations in which the United States and the Soviet Union have parallel interests than there are in which their interests are antithetical. Certainly, they have a common interest in avoiding nuclear war, in preventing the spread of nuclear weapons to additional states, in not poisoning the atmosphere with radioactive fallout from nuclear testing, in slowing up weapons development, technological rivalry, and the space race in order to direct more resources to domestic problems of poverty, social disorganization, and education, or in refraining from outbidding each other in grants of arms and aid to unreliable, ungrateful, unstable, and inefficient neutral regimes. One first clear evidence of recognition of this common interest was the peaceful settlement of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but the first formal agreement based on it was the Official Test Ban Treaty of 1963. This treaty not only aimed to maintain the stalemate between the two superpowers to the degree that it might be jeopardized by their future testing, it also sought to hamper the spread of nuclear weapons to additional powers by this restriction. Both superpowers and many neutrals feared that nuclear explosives would get into the control of Red China or other irresponsible hands. By the late 60s, considerations such as these revealed that there were considerable areas of common interest among the states of the world covering all 3 groups of the so-called free world: the communist bloc and the neutrals. Oh, so the 3 groups are the free world, the communist bloc, and the neutrals. Okay. The net result was the almost total disappearance of the world as seen by John Foster Dulles only a decade before. The 2-power world of Dulles was being replaced by a multi-block world in which the 2 superpowers, instead of being antithetical on all points, were finding large areas in which their interests were closer to each other than they were to those of some of the other, newer blocks, especially that growing up around Red China. Moreover, as we shall see, in some ways, the aims, methods, and structures of the 2 superpowers were converging on increasingly parallel courses. Most obviously, repugnant to Dulles would have been the rise of neutralism, evident not only in the increasing numbers and independence of neutral states, but in the disintegration of both the old superpower blocks as these weakened and dissolved, and former members of these, such as France in the West and Romania in the East, adopted increasingly neutralist policies. Shout out to Romania. As one obvious consequence of this, the paper groupings and barriers Dulles so painfully constructed in the 1950s were under liquidation as one of the chief tasks of the 1960s. This was evident with increasing obviousness in NATO, the Organization of American States, OAS, Centro, and CETO. Less obviously, except in the Far East, the same disintegrative process had been going on within the Soviet bloc, at first with Yugoslavia in 1948 and then with Red China in 1960, Albania, Romania, and others. This whole process of growing neutralism, diversity, and the disintegration of the superblocks, followed by the increasing emphasis of all groups on the problems of poverty, social disorganization, and spiritual nihilism, was possible only because of the growth of nuclear stalemate and must, throughout, be recognized as occurring under the umbrella of thermonuclear terror and from the danger of new, equally horrible biological weapons. The denouncement of the Cold War 1957 to 1963. Two revealing events in the late summer of 1957 offer conflicting evidence on the nature of the Soviet system. On August 26, the Kremlin claimed its first successful test of an ICBM. 1 month later, it announced that the sixth five-year plan had been scrapped and would be replaced by a new 7-year plan for 1957 to 1965. The meaning of this second announcement was difficult to evaluate, but it showed the regime's increasing difficulty in carrying out its grandiose economic projects, a difficulty that arose from the failures of the Soviet agricultural system. The state and collective farms used such quantities of equipment and manpower and gave such limited production in return that they became the chief limiting factor in the Soviet efforts to raise standards of living, to maintain the size and power of the defense forces, to win over third states by economic and technical assistance, and to lead the United States in the conquest of outer space. The output of food from the small private plots of Soviet peasantry, which were presumably worked only in their owners' spare time, produced 4 or 5 times the output per acre of the state and collective farms. See, communism just doesn't work. I mean, it's just a fact that if you do these collective farms and stuff, you don't let the actual farmers and business owners control their own business and work their own business, it doesn't produce as much. And then people start to starve and run out of products, consumer goods, and all this other stuff. So you guys keep pushing for this communist revolution, but it's just like ridiculous. It's been proven time after time that it doesn't work. This was, of course, an indication of the success of private enterprise as a spur in the productive process, a fact which was specifically recognized by Khrushchev in a series of speeches early in 1964. But in 1957 to 1959, this meaning of change in the Soviet economic plan was unrecognized, or at least disputable, and the world's attention became riveted instead on the Soviet success with its rocket boosters. From October 1957, over a period of 5 years, the Russians showed the way in outer space to the United States. In the newspapers and consequent world opinion, the margin of the Soviet superiority seemed much greater than it was in fact. On October 4th, Sputnik 1, weighing 184 pounds, was shot into an orbit around our Earth. A month later, Sputnik 2, weighing 1,120 pounds and containing a living dog, was also sent into successful orbit. But on December 6th, a much publicized effort by the United States in Project Vanguard failed in its attempt to place a small sphere of 3¼ pounds into orbit. On the last day of January 1958, the first American spacecraft, Explorer, weighing 31 pounds, successfully was shot into orbit around our Earth, but it was followed by another failure of Vanguard and a failure of Explorer 2 in the next 2 months. In the spring of 1958, our successes with Explorer 3, 31 pounds, and another failure with Vanguard were followed by the successful Sputnik 3, 2,925 pounds. The 2 years, 1958 and 1959, saw many American failures in space, 20 in all, mingled with 16 successful efforts, mostly in 1959. In January 1959, the Soviet government put Lunik 1, 3,245 pounds, in orbit around the Sun 5 months after our first lunar probe had failed. In September 1959, Lunik 2 hit the surface of the Moon, and a month later, Lunik 3 passed around the Moon, photographing its hidden side. In 1960 and 1961, the United States launched numerous successful space vehicles that gathered valuable scientific information. One of these, in January 1959, made the first broadcast from space, relaying messages from American ground stations. But in April and August 1961, Soviet vehicles successfully sent the first human beings into space. Vostok 1 was recovered after a single orbit, and Vostok 2, after 18 successful trips around the globe, was recovered the next day. These first space travelers, Major Yuri Gagarin and Major German S. Titov, returned safely to Soviet soil, descending to Earth in remarkable demonstrations of the Soviet success in controlling their space vehicles. The first American astronauts, Captain Alan B. Shepard, Jr., who made the suborbital flight of 117 miles in May 1961, and Colonel John H. Glenn, who orbited the Earth 3 times in February 1962, were recovered by landing in the ocean. In October, United States Navy Commander Walter M. Sharia made a similar landing after a smooth countdown and blastoff at Cape Canaveral, now called Cape Kennedy, and 6 orbits around the Earth. These American achievements were seen on television by millions of viewers and roused considerable praise throughout the world at the courage of the American government in permitting live broadcast of what could have turned into humiliating fiascos. The Soviet fiascos in space development, if any occurred, were well concealed, while their successes continued to astound the world at the end of 1962. In August of that year, the Russians, in less than 24 hours, blasted off Vostok 3 and Vostok 4, each with a human passenger, brought them within 4 miles of each other in space, and landed them together 6 minutes and 124 miles apart, after several days in space, most of it in weightless condition. This achievement was remarkable for its exhibition of control of the whole process, since the 2 vehicles were in almost identical orbits, almost came together in space, and broke all previous records for time and distance in space. Major A.G. Nikolaev circled the Earth 64 times, covered 1,625,000 miles, and was weightless for almost 4 days, during which he worked, ate, slept, and moved about in his capsule. His companion cosmonaut, Lieutenant Colonel P.R. Popovich, made 48 orbits around the Earth and was weightless for almost 3 days. These achievements in the Soviet space program were repeated in June 1963 by similar dual flights of Valentina Tereshkova, the first woman in space, who made 48 orbits, and Lieutenant Colonel Valery Bykovsky,
Bykovsky, who completed 81 orbits. The impact of these Soviet space spectaculars on world opinion was tremendous. To many neutrals, and even to some in Western nations, their exploits seemed to indicate that the Soviet Union had moved to first place in ability to apply science to technological development. Only gradually and never completely did realization spread that the Soviet Union, by announcing only its successes and concealing its failures, gave a misleading appearance of success. In time, it also began to appear that, while the Soviet Union unquestionably had tremendous boosters and almost unbelievable accuracy in firing them, the United States space effort included a greater number of attempts in much greater variety and size and yielded immensely larger amounts of scientific information. By 1963 to 1964, when the space rivalry had entered upon the race to place men on the moon, and both sides were beginning to have doubts about the wisdom of this, or at least the wisdom of racing to it, it became clearer that the American space effort was larger, sounder, and more fruitful to science than the amazing and earlier exploits of the Soviet Union. But no such process of reevaluation could change the fact that the first men in space were Russians, Yuri Gagarin and German S. Titov in 1961. The Soviet successes in space had a triple impact on the United States, with the final result that the whole movement of American life was turned in a new direction. The psychological impact was the least important in spite of its force. More significant was the influence on American education and economic development. The economic impact of Sputnik and Vostok was such as to direct immense resources throughout government spending towards research in science and technology. By 1964, after 6 years of its existence, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA, had settled down to an annual budget of over $5 billion a year. Sums as large were directed by government sources into research and development in science, medicine, and technology. As a consequence, the whole pattern of American education was changed, and so was the relationship between government and education, as well as the public and education. The educational system was brought into tempestuous, tempestuous into the tempestuous atmosphere of the frantic American marketplace and was being ransacked from the highest levels down to high school and even below for talented, trained, or merely eager people. That was like that Real Geniuses movie with Val Kilmer, where they were enlisting all the like kids out of college to like build like space lasers and stuff. What was that movie? It was called Real Geniuses, I think, right? It was with Val Kilmer in like the 80s. Check it out. As the demand for such people grew and their remunerations and opportunities increased, the substantial minority who were not talented, trained, or eager found fewer and fewer opportunities to make a living and began to sink downward toward a steadily growing lower class of social outcast and underprivileged, the socially self-perpetuating group of the impoverished. At the same time, within the Soviet Union, similar revolutionary changes were taking place as millions were called from rural and depressed urban areas to educational opportunities and upward advancement in technological skills and social rewards. The socialist pretenses of equal rewards were gradually abandoned, and increased emphasis on individual enterprise, advancing hierarchies of wealth and power, and disparate compensation for ambition, application, talent, and ability. Okay, that sounds like a meritocracy, and it sounds like capitalism. Doesn't sound anything like communism or socialism. And again, it's proving
that as soon as you guys think that you're going to take down the government and all this other stuff, you're just going to end up doing a capitalist hierarchy anyway. So just give it a break. It's ridiculous.
On the whole, as we shall see, there was a development of Soviet and American ways of life, not only in convergence towards each other, but in a sense away from life in most other nations. During this period of convergence of the Soviet and American ways towards a more highly developed scientific and technological system, there was simultaneously a superficial sharpening of their political struggle and a less obvious opening of numerous bridges of cooperation between them. Such bridges appeared first in those areas of scientific and educational life where they were developing away from the majority of other nations. It appeared in such a remarkable example of international cooperation as the International Geophysical Year, July 1957 to the end of 1958, and more specifically in the Soviet-American agreements on cultural and educational changes, such as that for 1958 and 1959, signed in January 1958. These brought scientists, teachers, musical performers, industrialists, and even tourists from one country to the other. In November 1958, two unconnected events began the process that led, in 4 years, to the Cuban Missile Crisis and the relaxation of the Cold War. On November 27th, Khrushchev, filled with self-confidence and truculence, sent a note to the Western powers demanding settlement of the Berlin problem, under the threat that the Soviet Union, at the end of 6 months, would itself sign a peace treaty with the East German government, would withdraw its own forces from the area, and hand over its rights to Berlin, including control of the Allied access routes into the city, to the East German government. Because the Western powers did not recognize the East German regime, this action would not only force such recognition, but would force them to negotiate with East Germany over rights based on victory and agreement with the Soviet Union, which were not negotiable, particularly with it. When Khrushchev sent this ultimatum on November 27, 1958, NATO had only 21 divisions, one-third of them West German, to defend its position in Europe. But the next day, America's Atlas ICBM, for the first time, shot full range of 6,325 miles. While the 6 months of Khrushchev's ultimatum were ticking off, the two hostile camps began to disintegrate internally in Western Europe and in the Far East. In the Far East, the first year of Red China's 5-year plan, the so-called Great Leap Forward, began to collapse within 6 months of its beginning. Apparently, to cover this up, the Chinese government began to adopt a very aggressive attitude toward the nationalist Chinese government on Formosa, Taiwan, and prepared to mount an all-out assault on its forces on the Chinese territorial lands of Matsu and Quemoy, which were still under Chiang Kai-shek's control. The strong support Dulles gave to Chiang, including reinforcements by American naval carrier task forces, and his psychological readiness to go to the brink of war, spread down to all parts of the world. The Red Chinese threat gradually petered out, and they made extensive demands on Moscow for military, technical, and financial assistance. About the same time, France made demands on the United States to prevent any possibility of Europe becoming involved in a nuclear war arising from unilateral American action in the Far East or elsewhere in France, in which France had not been consulted. That's fair. Two demands from Peking and Paris soon showed the disintegrative features developing within the two superblocks. Red China's demand for assistance from Moscow could not be met, for the simple reason that the Kremlin could not fill the demands of the Soviet Union itself, caught as it was in a three-way vice of faltering agricultural systems, the increasing demands of the Russians themselves for improved standards of living, and the needs of the missile and space races with the United States. Accordingly, the Chinese-Soviet Technical Assistance Agreement of February 1959 offered only 5 billion rubles over the next 6 years, approximately half the amount that had been provided during the previous 6 years. Within 6 months, Red China began aggressions against its inaccessible borders with India and was making increasingly unfavorable comments about Khrushchev's doctrines of peaceful coexistence with capitalism and the inevitable victory of socialism without war. In the same 6 months, the United States was having growing difficulties with France within NATO. In September 1958, de Gaulle asked that a tripart directorate be established in the United States, Britain, and France to provide consultation on a global basis wider than the European limited control exercised through NATO. This demand was very well founded, since America's actions in Quai Moi or in the landing of American Marines in Lebanon in July 1958 might have led to war with the Soviet Union and a Soviet attack on Western Europe over an area and issue in France which had not been involved or consulted. De Gaulle's request was rejected. As soon as the imperious general had been inaugurated as the first president of the Fifth French Republic, January 1959, he took steps to extricate France from some of the French commitments to NATO. The French Mediterranean fleet was removed from NATO control. The use of France as a base for nuclear weapons, either from planes or missiles, was refused, and French participation in a unified European air defense system was denied. In two-day talks in Paris, December 19th through 20th, 1959, the two presidents, Eisenhower and de Gaulle, went over the ground again and reached a stalemate. Eisenhower rejected de Gaulle's suggestion for a three-power global policy directorate, and de Gaulle rejected Eisenhower's desire for an integrated air and naval defense system for Europe. While these positions were developing, a significant turning point in Soviet-American relations appeared during Khrushchev's visit to the United States, September 15th through 17th, 1959. The Kremlin leader was full of his usual talk of the inevitable future victory of socialism and the need for peaceful coexistence until that time. He welcomed competition in the economic or technological affairs, in athletic or cultural matters, but he ruled out the need for war or the legitimacy of aggression by either side. At first, he refused to be impressed with the wealth and power of America, implying that it was not surprising to him that the Soviet Union could do it better at some future date. But gradually, a very important change occurred. In spite of himself, he was impressed. He ceased to pretend to himself that the things he saw were some special exhibits set up, regardless of cost, to delude him. Gradually, the incredible truth dawned in his mind. Many Americans actually lived like this, in what the ordinary Russian would regard as unbelievable luxury. The real revelation came when he visited farms in Iowa, saw the equipment and way of life of these successful American farmers, and found out the economic statistics of American agriculture at its best. For years afterward, he talked of these matters, and as recently as April 1964, he told the Hungarians about it and advised them to emulate the American farmers. Khrushchev's journey was notable in other ways. At Camp David with President Eisenhower, he revoked his 6-month time limit for settling the German question on the ground that the consideration of the problem by the Foreign Ministers' Conference of the summer of 1959 had suspended the urgency of the problem. At the meeting of the General Assembly of the United Nations in September, Khrushchev won considerable support for his suggestion that the Soviet Union was willing to reach complete disarmament supervised by mutual controls, including aerial photography. During his visit, Soviet Foreign Minister Gromyko provided a curious glimpse into the intricacies of the Soviet system. At Camp David, he tried to make a deal binding each party to limit its propaganda radio broadcast to the other to 3 hours a day, with the unstated implication that Moscow might stop jamming the Voice of America if this agreement was reached. Although our broadcasts in Russian at the time were only 3 hours a day, we refused the offer by saying that we wished to increase, not reduce, the flow of information. Gromyko left the impression that the jamming was an expense and burden on the Soviet system. At any rate, in June 1963, with the relaxation of the Cold War, jamming was stopped by the Russians without any agreement. The weakening of the Soviet position, which the Kremlin recognized in regard to missiles in 1961, also appeared to them in other fields, and was fully apparent to anyone who wished to look at the comparative prosperity of the two superblocks. Nowhere did this comparison stand out more clearly than in divided Germany, and nowhere could the Kremlin accept it less readily. In 1950s and 1960s, the contrast between the East German Democratic Republic and the West German Federal Republic were as between night and day. The West, with about 55 million persons, was booming, while the East, with less than 17 million, was grim and depressed. The Western German economic miracle was based, as we have said, on low wages, hard work, and vigorous pursuit of profits by private enterprise, little hampered by the government or labor unions. Oh, really? You get more money when you don't have labor unions and government? Wow, I would have never thought that. It was, in fact, the closest example of traditional 19th century laissez-faire that the mid-20th century had to offer. The government, under the influence of Minister of Economics, later Chancellor Ludwig Erhard, operated in terms of what they called a socially conscious free market economy. But the play of free economic forces was to be found in lack of interference by the government and competitive wage rates rather than in price competition among industrial producers. The fluctuations of the business cycle were dampered down by the government's fiscal policy, and it was said that possible inequities in the distribution of the national product could be remedied by a progressive income tax mild enough not to interfere with incentives. Otherwise, taxes were drawn to encourage industry to plow its profits back into business rather than to raise wages. This policy and the national tendencies of the German outlook favored production of capital goods over consumer goods and for the export market rather than for domestic use. After 1945, labor unions, which had been closely associated with political activities and with agitations for drastic economic and social reforms before the Nazi regime enslaved them, sought to avoid politics and to concentrate on wages and work conditions, as do unions in the United States. But these activities in Germany had traditionally been the concern of other agencies, such as works councils, and they could hardly be much influenced by unions in a period of surplus labor and low wages, as such as prevailed in Germany in the 1950s. This surplus of labor in West Germany came from the influx of 13 million refugees into the area, chiefly from East Germany and Czechoslovakia. Once the boom started, the demand for labor was so great that refugees continued to be welcomed, and at least 2/3 of a million non German, unskilled workers were imported from Italy, Greece, Spain, and elsewhere in southern Europe. The docility and eagerness to work of these peoples kept wages low, profits high, and the boom going through the 1950s into the 1960s. As late as 1960, only 38,000 man days of labor were lost by strikes and lockouts in West Germany, compared to almost 500,000 in the Netherlands, 3 million in the United Kingdom, and 19 million in the United States in that year. Some of the consequences of this system, besides the most obvious one of booming prosperity, were that the structure of monopolized industry, with great rewards for the upper classes, with lesser rewards and little social mobility for workers, continued in the 1950s as it had been in Germany since its industrialization began. In 1958, eight great trusts still controlled 75% of crude steel production, 80% of raw iron, 60% of rolled steel, and 36% of coal output. The number of millionaires in marks more than doubled in 4 years in the middle of the 1950s. Yet less than half of the eligible workers were in unions. Union membership went up only 20%, while the working force increased 67% after 1949, and only an insignificant part, 5% of university students came from working class, compared to a rate of 5 times as high in Great Britain. To the outside world and to most Germans, especially East Germans, the inner nature and structure of the West German economic miracle was of little significance. What did matter was that the average West German had steady work at adequate wages and limitless hope for the future. The 10% increase each year in the West German gross national product was something that could not be denied or belittled. Among those who had no desire to ignore it or to belittle it, but on the contrary were eager to participate in it, were the East Germans. They continued to flee westward from poverty and despotism to plenty and freedom. Every effort made by the communist regime to stem that flow merely served to increase it. The more police who were sent to guard the frontier between East and West Germany, the more police there were to flee westward with the others. The reasons for these flights to the west were clear enough. East Germany had been a Stalinized regime under an unpopular tyrant who is sustained by 22 Russian divisions because he is willing to administer East Germany as an economic colony of Soviet Empire. In spite of Khrushchev's denunciations of Stalinism, he supported a Stalinist regime under Walter Ulbricht, the communist dictator of East Germany, because that type of regime extracted the largest booty from its territory for the Kremlin. All right. I'm going to stop reading there because this chapter, I'm sure it's just going to keep going on. Yeah. Like another 6 pages or something in that one. All right. So, I mean, we can see that the most obvious premise in this section is the fact that kind of diversity is our strength. Not saying racial diversity, but it seems like the fact that American independence, like when they were making the bomb, they were making all different types and sizes of bombs, and different companies were working on different methods and uses, while the Soviet Union was like top down, and they're like, we just have to build the biggest bomb and the biggest rocket. Well, we're like, let's try this one, let's try this one, let's try the whole competitive aspect. While it does suck, especially for the people that lose, like me, myself, I personally am a loser.
but it's still more beneficial overall for the entire society to have the competitive aspect. And you can see that it's been demonstrated in this book, and this guy's not even really against the Soviet Union, that, competitive um, production with incentives, meaning like money or some type of reward that you get more than the other person that did less, meritocracy, seems to produce the most amount of wealth and prosperity for a country. And you can argue with that, and you can get mad and throw a fit and have a protest and say we got to take down the rich, and they're all scumbags and this and that. And look, I'm not saying that everybody's perfect. Obviously, there's a huge in the club aspect to being rich, right? We can see that from the Epstein files, right? There's some type of in the club aspect to it. But in general, the general theory of, competitive cooperation, allowing the people that are in the field, allowing a farmer to run his farm, allowing a businessman to run his business, allowing the police to run the police station, instead of having some far off dictator that really doesn't even have any skin in the game in your local region dictating how it's going to go so that they can skim off the top. And like you can say, okay, capitalists skim off the top too with the stock market, right? But it's still, even in a system where both leadership classes are skimming off the top, you want to be in the system where at least it's going up. The top is going up. Where it's like the Soviet Union, communism, the top doesn't go up. It just, whatever. That's why they have to take over capitalism. So whatever point you were at, or whatever point the capitalists were at when the communists take over the means of production, you guys are stuck there because you can't produce the innovation and the things that are needed to raise everybody up. The rising tide raises all ships, and you might be on the bottom level of the boat. At least your boat's going up. Where the communist, the Soviet style boat, it's not going up. It's just the people at the top are just not going to drown. They're going to drown last when the boat sinks. And so you could say, oh, it's worse. It's slavery. All governmental systems are slavery. Whether you bring in communism, you're gonna have to enslave the whites and us black people that don't want to vote for transgenders and all that other stuff, right? So it's like you're not any better. And then if you look objectively at which system provides more food, which is the thing that you guys are all complaining about, more food, more healthcare, more human security, physical safety, it's capitalism. And I'm not a capitalist realist. I'm like, we could probably move past this system, but we don't want to go back to communism, which is proven that it's failed in like every country, where it's like now China's a free market economy, basically. Like they're socially still like more top down dictatorial. But as far as them getting stuff and like the material goods that you guys are all complaining about, free market every time. Russia, free market, right? Look at North Korea versus South Korea. South Korea, amazing country. North Korea, no one wants to go there, right? You can see here, East Germany versus West Germany. I met people that like guys that lived in East Germany, and they were like, yeah, didn't want to go back. Not fun. They're like, there's like one brand of toilet paper, one brand of soda. That's it. No choice. When the stores run out, there's no restocking. So you guys can do your little communist uprising, and then all you're going to end up, even if you win, which I really doubt that that's going to happen, but even if you did, all you would do is just end up doing capitalism anyway. So it's like ridiculous. It's a joke. I'm sorry, it is. Might not be a joke when you guys start trying to attack everybody, but I'm saying the actual philosophy and the logic behind it, you guys aren't using logic. All right. I'm going to get out of here with that. Thanks for watching the video if you did. If you didn't, you won't hear this part anyway. So have a good day and peace.